The birth of a promise. The silence of Israel's despair echoed through the land, for the people had again done evil in the eyes of the Lord. Oppression weighed heavy. The Philistines ruled for 40 long years, their dominance suffocating, their control unyielding. In the midst of this bleak season, in a village tucked away in the hill country of Zorah, a barren woman waited in quiet grief. She had no child. Her arms remained empty while others embraced the joys of motherhood. But she did not know that heaven had already turned its gaze upon her. One day, without warning, the angel of the Lord appeared to her, clothed in radiant mystery. He spoke with calm authority. "You are barren," he said, "but you will conceive and give birth to a son." He gave strict instructions. She must drink no wine or strong drink, eat nothing unclean, for the child would be a Nazirite, set apart from the womb. He will begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines. The woman trembled, not in fear, but in awe. She told her husband Manoah of the encounter. He listened, then cried out to the Lord, "Please let the man of God come again to teach us how to raise the boy." And God heard. The angel returned once more, visiting the woman in the field. She ran to fetch Manoah, and he came, heart-pounding, with hope and curiosity. He asked the visitor, "What is your name? When your words are fulfilled, we want to honor you." But the angel answered, "Why do you ask my name? It is beyond understanding." Manoah offered a goat as a sacrifice. As the flames rose from the altar, the angel ascended in the fire and vanished into the sky. Then Manoah knew. "We have seen God," he whispered in terror. But his wife, steady and faithful, replied, "If the Lord intended to kill us, he would not have accepted our offering." Soon after, she bore a son. They named him Samson. And the boy grew, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he was still young. In the camp of Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol, from his earliest days, Samson was different. He was not raised like other children. No razor ever touched his head. He did not drink wine or eat what was forbidden. He was marked. The weight of purpose lingered over him like a mantle, invisible to others, undeniable to those who knew. As he grew into manhood, the strength within him could not be ignored. It was not ordinary. It came upon him suddenly, powerfully, as if lightning from the skies had surged through his veins. He once tore a young lion apart with his bare hands, a feat so astonishing that he kept it secret even from his parents. When he later returned to the carcass, he found bees had nested in it. From the hollow body of the dead beast, he scooped honey and shared it with his parents, another secret. Power and mystery followed him. Yet strength was not his only desire. In Timnah, a Philistine woman caught his eye. She pleased him. He demanded of his father, "Get her for me. She is the right one for me." His parents were disturbed. "Is there no woman among our own people?" they asked. But Samson was unyielding. They did not know that this desire, flawed and fleshly, was part of a larger plan. God was seeking a confrontation with the Philistines, and Samson's passion would ignite the spark. So the arrangements were made. A wedding was planned. On the Ei's way to Timnah, Samson's thoughts wandered to the riddle he would give his companions. From the eater came something to eat. From the strong came something sweet. They could not solve it. Their frustration turned to threat. They pressed his wife, and she pleaded with Samson until he gave in. She revealed the answer. Furious at the betrayal, Samson left in rage. He killed 30 men in Ashkelon to settle his wager and returned home without her. His wife was given to another man. The fire was lit. Vengeance burned. Samson, wounded by betrayal and consumed by anger, set foxes loose in the Philistine fields with torches tied to their tails. The grain, the vineyards, the olive groves destroyed. The Philistines retaliated, burning his wife and her father. The cycle deepened. Samson struck them down without mercy and fled to the cleft of the rock in Etam. The men of Judah, afraid of Philistine retaliation, came to bind Samson. "Don't you realize the Philistines rule over us?" they said. But Samson agreed to go peacefully if they swore not to kill him themselves. They tied him with new ropes and delivered him. As he approached Lehi, the Philistines shouted in triumph. But the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. The ropes melted from his hands like flax burned with fire. Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he seized it and struck down 1,000 men. Bloodied and breathless, he stood amidst the fallen and said, "With a donkey's jawbone I have made donkeys of them." Exhausted, he cried out to God, "Have you given your servant this great victory only to let me die of thirst?" So God split a hollow place in the ground and water gushed out. Samson drank, his strength returned, and he revived. He judged Israel for 20 years in the days of Philistine domination. But the battles he fought were not only with enemies. The real war waged in his heart. The man set apart from birth, empowered by divine strength, could not escape the pull of his own desires. The contradictions were growing. In secret moments when no enemy threatened, he wandered down paths of compromise. The calling remained, the strength endured, but the cracks were beginning to form. A man who could break chains. Samson walked into Gaza, the heart of Philistine power, with no fear in his step. There he saw a prostitute and went in to spend the night. Word spread quickly. Samson, the enemy of the Philistines, was in their city. They surrounded the place and waited at the gate through the night, whispering plans of ambush. "At dawn we will kill him," they said. But before the sun rose, Samson got up. With supernatural might pulsing through his limbs, he approached. The city gate seized its doors, pulled them up with the posts, and carried them on his shoulders. He marched uphill to Hebron, leaving the gate, symbols of Philistine strength, scattered behind him. No man dared follow. No army could stop him. Yet while walls could not hold him, passions would. Time passed. Then came Delilah. She lived in the valley of Sorek, and she captivated him. He loved her with the same reckless intensity that marked every part of his life. The Philistine rulers came to her, offering silver in exchange for one thing, the secret of his strength. "Find out how he can be subdued," they demanded, "so we may tie him up and overpower him." Delilah agreed. The scheme began. One night as they lay together, she whispered, "Tell me the secret of your strength and how you can be tied up and subdued." He smiled, amused. "If I am bound with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, I'll become as weak as any man." She waited until he slept, then called in the ambushers. As the men hid, she tied him with the bowstrings. "Samson, the Philistines are upon you," she cried. But he snapped the strings like thread near a flame. The trap failed. Delilah's pride was wounded. She accused him. "You made a fool of me. You lied. Now tell me the truth." Again, Samson toyed with her. "If I'm tied with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become weak." She tried again. The same result. The ropes fell like twine from his arms. Her voice turned sharp. "You're mocking me," she said, her eyes filled with tears. He offered a third lie. "If you weave the 7 braids of my hair into a loom and tighten it with a pin, I'll be like any man." That night as he slept, she did exactly that. She cried out, the ambushers moved. But Samson awoke, pulled the pin, and walked free again. His strength remained, but the edge was wearing thin. Delilah's tears turned to torment. Day after day she pressed him. Her voice did not stop. Her presence became a storm, and Samson, worn down, gave in. "No razor has ever touched my head," he confessed. "I've been a Nazirite from birth. If my head is shaved, my strength will leave me. I'll be like any other man." Delilah saw the truth in his eyes. That night, as he slept on her lap, she summoned a man to shave off his hair. The 7 locks fell. His strength vanished. The Lord had departed from him. Delilah shouted as before, and Samson awoke. But this time, his arms did not surge with power. He rose, expecting to shake them off as always, but nothing came. The Philistines seized him. They gouged out his eyes. They shackled him with bronze chains and led him, blind and broken, to grind grain in the prison at Gaza. The man who once tore lions apart now turned a millstone like a beast of burden. But his Hair began to grow again. In the darkness of prison, stripped of sight and strength, Samson faced the weight of his downfall. His enemies laughed. The people who once trembled before his fury now mocked his weakness. Yet something stirred beneath the humiliation, not just the regrowth of hair, but the slow kindling of remembrance. Samson began to pray, not for revenge, but for restoration. He remembered the call. He remembered the vow. The God who once empowered him had not forgotten him. Time passed. Then came the feast. The Philistine rulers gathered in the temple of Dagon to celebrate their victory over Samson. 3,000 men and women filled the rooftop, drinking and jeering. They summoned Samson from the prison to entertain them. Blind and led by a servant, he stood between the pillars that held up the entire structure. He whispered to the boy, who guided him, "Place me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple." The boy obeyed. Samson reached out with both hands and felt the stone columns. He raised his head and prayed, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me once more. Let me with one final blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my eyes." Then, with hands on both pillars, he pushed. The temple groaned. The ground trembled. With one final cry, he said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And the temple collapsed. The rulers died. The people on the roof died. Samson died. But in his death he killed more enemies than in his life. His brothers came for his body and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol. He had led Israel for 20 years, and so the man of strength met his end not in glory but in redemption. His strength was never truly his. His downfall was not just a matter of passion, but of pride. Yet even in failure, his story turned back, toward purpose. Not because of his hair, not because of revenge, but because the God who called him from the womb still heard him in the pit. Strength without surrender. Samson's story didn't begin in chains, but it would always be shaped by what those chains revealed. Even before his birth, his life was marked by divine intention. His strength was a gift, real, raw, wild. But without surrender, even divine strength can become dangerous. From his youth, he was driven not by wisdom but by impulse. His hands were mighty, yet his heart remained untamed. He judged Israel, yes, but he often walked alone. He served a divine mission but lived with divided loyalties, and the cost of that division was high. Still, God's presence lingered. His spirit moved, even in flawed vessels. The law of the Nazirite vow was not merely about hair or diet. It was a call to holiness, to separation. Samson's strength was not in his muscles but in his consecration. But consecration without obedience becomes hollow. Time after time, Samson walked into danger with pride. He believed himself invincible. He mistook God's patience for permission. When he touched the dead lion's carcass and ate honey from within, he violated his vow. When he chose a Philistine bride, he stepped outside the covenant people. When he lay in Gaza with a prostitute, he ignored the sacred trust placed upon him. Each step wasn't a stumble. It was a warning ignored. Yet still God waited. Still God moved. Still God reached. The tragedy of Samson is not only that he fell, but that he never fully embraced who he was meant to be. He wielded power but never cultivated character. He crushed enemies but failed to conquer himself. He could tear down city gates but not his own pride. His life was filled with divine moments but rarely divine intimacy. God used him, yes, but how much more could have come if Samson had truly surrendered? He judged Israel for 20 years, yet we hear little of peace, wisdom, or justice. Instead, we remember vengeance, riddles, women, and war. His legacy is complex. Not because God failed, but because Samson never let God shape the whole man, not just the warrior. Yet grace runs deeper than failure. Even in betrayal, when Delilah shaved his locks and his strength fled, God did not abandon him. In the prison of Gaza, blind and broken, Samson met the silence of consequences. It was there, grinding grain like an animal, that something shifted. The absence of sight became the beginning of insight. The man who had once been led by passion now had to be led by a servant. And perhaps in that helplessness, he began to hear the voice he had long ignored. His prayer before his final act was short, raw, and real. Remember me. Not, make me mighty again. Not, bring back my glory. Just, remember. That single word revealed more surrender than all his previous acts of strength combined. The Lord remembered him. The strength returned, not as a reward, but as a final act of mercy. In his death, Samson achieved what he had not in life, a decisive blow against Israel's enemies. He became, in the end, what he was called to be, a deliverer, not perfect, not whole, but used by God still. And that is the mystery of divine calling. It does not rely on our perfection but on God's purpose. Samson's name, etched into the book of Judges, stands not just as a warning, but as a window. A glimpse into the tension between gifting and obedience, between power and purity, between being chosen and being changed. Israel at the time had no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Samson was a mirror of his generation, powerful, impulsive, unstable. He carried the call, but not the crown. He was set apart, but lived apart from wisdom. His story ends in rubble, but not in defeat. Because the God who used him still ruled. The God who gave strength also gave grace. The God who watched him fall also heard him cry. In that, Samson's story speaks, not just of might, but of mercy, not just of downfall, but of possibility. Even in the darkest cell, the light of divine remembrance flickers, and perhaps that is why his name appears again, unexpectedly, in the letter to the Hebrews, among the faithful. Not because he was flawless, but because he trusted God in the end. Not because he lived perfectly, but because he died believing. His final act, though violent, was born from surrender, and God honored it. That moment, beneath the collapsing temple, was not just judgment. It was redemption. One final chance to say, "This strength was never mine, it was yours." And in that moment, Samson, the flawed judge, became a faithful servant. The chain breaker returned to the one who had called him from the womb. And that return is what lingers, not the failure, but the finish. The weight of unused potential. Samson's life carried a paradox. Strength beyond imagination, yet obedience that wavered. From the moment of his calling, his destiny was intertwined with divine intention. But potential without discipline is like fire without boundaries, brilliant but destructive. His early triumphs had been marked by explosions of might, acts of sheer dominance. The lion torn apart, the jawbone wielded like a sword, the gates of Gaza hoisted high. And yet, what lay beneath each act was not just power. It was a deep hunger. Not only for justice, but for attention, for affirmation, for indulgence. Samson wanted to be used by God, but on his terms, and that contradiction would follow him to the grave. In the absence of external enemies, Samson wrestled with internal ones. His story is not a cautionary tale about strength alone, but about the silence that follows when calling becomes a burden, instead of a mission. He had been set apart, yes, but he often set himself apart from God. In the years of his judging, we see little evidence of transformation. He operated by instinct, not instruction. His strength was undeniable, but his weakness was loud, lust disguised as love, rage masquerading as justice, pride presented as leadership. The more victories he claimed, the less he reflected the one who empowered him. And though the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, Samson never truly walked in the Spirit. He remained a man divided. The greatest tragedy was not his blindness in Gaza, it was the blindness that had long preceded it. Long before Delilah, there were signs. He married the enemy. He violated his vows. He toyed with holy things. And yet God remained faithful. That's what makes his story both painful and beautiful. Because even when Samson treated divine power like a personal weapon, God didn't withdraw his hand. Why? Because God's purposes are not thwarted by human frailty. But that grace is not a license. It's a longing for the chosen to become aligned, a longing for the strong to become surrendered. But Samson, for so long, refused to yield. He was always on the edge of breakthrough, yet falling back into pattern. And pattern, when repeated, becomes prison. He had the favor of God but lacked the fear of God. He had influence but not intimacy. That is the true weight of unused potential. It haunts the called who never yield. It echoes in the chambers of the heart, whispering what could have been. Not every failure in Samson's life was final, but each compromise added weight to a soul already leaning away from its source. He could destroy armies, but he couldn't kill pride. He could tear down walls, but he couldn't build altars. And the people he led, they remained untransformed. Because strength alone cannot save, it must be shaped by surrender. The grinding stone in Gaza was more than punishment. It was the echo of a life that refused to be molded. Blind, broken, humiliated, Samson finally began to see. And in that final moment of prayer, we witnessed something shift. Not just desperation, but confession. Not just pain, but presence. He no longer asks for glory. He asks to be remembered. He no longer seeks vengeance first. He seeks the God who never left. And in that moment, the weight of unused potential is lifted, not by restoration of strength, but by a posture of surrender. That's where redemption begins, not in power, but in the return of a humbled heart. Samson's final act may have looked like revenge, but in heaven's eyes it was surrender. His hands, once used to grasp what pleased him, now pushed pillars in submission to a greater will. His body, once driven by passion, now became a vessel of obedience. His death, though violent, became a hinge between failure and fulfillment, because in that moment the boy who had been chosen before birth became finally the man God had envisioned. And while his eyes were gone, his soul had never seen more clearly. So what do we do with a life like Samson's? Do we honor his strength or mourn his weakness? The answer is yes to both. We honor what God placed in him. We mourn what pride distorted. But more than that, we learn that gifting is not destiny unless it is yielded. That divine calling is not the same as divine character. That failure is not final when placed into the hands of a redeemer. Samson's name stands in the scriptures not as an exception but as a mirror, a reminder that God still uses the broken. That strength must bow to surrender, that the weight of unused potential can be lifted when we return, not with pride but with prayer. And perhaps the most profound part of Samson's legacy is this: he was remembered, not by men who mocked him, not by enemies who celebrated his fall, but by God. When he prayed in the dark, the silence broke. When he asked to be remembered, heaven leaned close. And that is the hope for every life marked by failure and fire. That even when the world sees rubble, God still sees redemption. Redemption beneath the rubble. The sound of collapsing pillars was not just the end of Samson. It was the collapse of everything he once trusted in: his strength, his pride, his self-will. That moment beneath the rubble was not defeat. It was divine redemption. For years, Samson had lived divided, consecrated but carnal, chosen but compromised. He judged a nation, yet failed to govern himself. He carried the Spirit, yet often quenched its fire. But in the darkness of his final moments, something deeper awakened. Not brute power, but broken surrender. Not the roar of battle, but the whisper of prayer. "Sovereign Lord, remember me," he said, not to reclaim his former glory, but to be seen, known, forgiven. That prayer carried the weight of his entire life and the hope of his soul. For the first time, Samson asked not for himself, but from a place of submission. His request wasn't rooted in pride, but in repentance. Remember me. Strengthen me once more. Not so he could feel powerful again, but so he could fulfill the purpose he had been born for. In that moment, strength and surrender finally stood together. And when the temple of Dagon crumbled, it wasn't just a structure that fell. It was the fall of idolatry, the fall of shame, the fall of every whispered lie that said his failures were final. God answered not because Samson was perfect, but because he finally prayed as a man who knew he was not. In his death, Samson achieved what he could not in his life, a decisive act of deliverance for Israel, not through military strategy, not through charisma, but through sacrifice. His body became the offering. His final breath became the message that God still redeems, that calling doesn't expire, that even when we run, grace waits, and when we return, bruised, blind, broken, He listens, He acts, He remembers. The rubble of that Philistine temple became the altar where Samson's story was rewritten. From failure to faith, from rebellion to redemption, from a man who lived for himself to a servant who died for others. The people who had once mocked him never saw it coming. They had paraded him as a trophy of their false god's power. They thought Yahweh had forsaken his champion. But Yahweh does not abandon his own. Even in judgment, mercy had the final word. Even in chains, purpose remained. God's plans are not limited by our past. They are revealed in our repentance. And in Samson's final breath, that truth echoed louder than any roar from the crowds. His fall was not his end. It was his transformation, from spectacle to symbol, from disgrace to deliverance. And what about Israel? They watched from the shadows. Samson had been their judge, unpredictable, untamed, unorthodox. But in the end, he stood between two pillars as a man of faith. Not just muscle, but mission. Not just might, but meaning. His story reminded a broken nation that God's deliverance often comes through the unexpected, that even flawed vessels, when yielded, can bring freedom. Samson's name would be whispered for generations, not as a warning only, but as a witness. That redemption is possible, that no fall is too deep, that God's mercy meets us beneath the rubble. Perhaps the most profound legacy of Samson is not what he did, but what he became. He was no longer the man who chased after what pleased him. He was the man who, in his final hour, gave himself fully to the God who had called him. And heaven recorded it. Hebrews 11, the great hall of faith, includes his name, not for his perfection, but for his faith, not for his consistency, but for his surrender. That is the paradox of grace. It does not demand that we never fall, but that we trust the one who lifts us when we do. Samson's final act also carried a prophetic shadow. A lone man standing between two pillars, arms outstretched, giving his life to crush the power of the enemy. Sound familiar? Many centuries later, another man would stretch out his arms, not in vengeance, but in love. Not to destroy, but to save. Jesus, the true deliverer, would accomplish in full what Samson pointed to in part. And while Samson died blind, Jesus opened the eyes of the blind. While Samson killed his enemies, Jesus forgave them. While Samson pushed pillars to judge, Jesus bore judgment upon himself. One act pointed to the next. One flawed judge preparing the way for a perfect Savior. So what do we carry from Samson's story? That strength is not enough. That calling demands surrender. That failure is not the end. And that God still remembers. The rubble is not your grave. It is your altar. Your pain can become your offering. Your brokenness can become your bridge to grace. Samson's story is not just ancient history. It is a mirror. We are all strong in some ways and fragile in others. We all carry potential. We all face temptation. But the question is, will we surrender? Will we let God shape not just our gifts but our hearts? In the end, Samson's eyes were closed, but his soul was finally open. And the God who had chosen him before birth stood with him after every fall. That is the gospel before the gospel. That grace waits at the end of every road. That redemption is stronger than regret. That even when the pillars fall, the purpose stands. Because the God who begins a good work is faithful to complete it, even through flawed hands, even beneath the rubble. Legacy in the ashes. The dust settled in Gaza. The laughter of the Philistines had long since turned to silence. Where once a blind man stood mocked and humiliated, now stood only ruins, collapsed stone, crushed idols, and the memory of something greater than strength, surrender. But Samson's story didn't end in death. It continued, carried not by the muscles of a man but by the memory of mercy. Because legacies are not written by how a life begins, nor by how often one stumbles, but by what remains when everything else falls. And what remained from Samson's collapse was not defeat. It was a testimony that even the mightiest can fall, that even the fallen can rise, that God's purposes do not end in rubble, they begin there. Israel, for a moment, saw what could happen when a man gave everything, even broken and blind, into the hands of God. They didn't just bury Samson, they buried with him the shame of wasted potential and lifted from the ashes a new understanding of divine grace. For 20 years, he had judged them, but in his death he delivered them. Not through perfect leadership, not through flawless obedience, but through one final act of faith. That is what legacy looks like. Not perfection, but persistence. Not strength without weakness, but surrender despite weakness. Samson's hands once held weapons, but in the end, they held purpose. And that is the beauty of grace. It turns what the enemy meant for spectacle into sacrifice. It redeems what was broken. It remembers the forgotten. The name Samson would never again just mean strong. It would mean something deeper, used, forgiven, remembered. His life would not be told just in the pages of shame, but in the songs of salvation. And God would not be ashamed to be called his God, because what mattered most was not that Samson had fallen, but that in the end he fell into the hands of mercy. And those hands, far stronger than his, redeemed everything he had once lost. That is what grace does. It rewrites stories. It resurrects destinies. It transforms pillars of failure into monuments of faith. But what about us? What do we do with Samson's ashes? We look closely. We examine our own hearts. We stop pretending that strength alone will carry us. We stop measuring worth by public victories and start honoring the private altars. We learn that it is not in might nor in power, but in the surrender of our spirit that God builds legacies. Samson's fall teaches us that gifts are not enough. Anointing without obedience leads to ruin. Power without purpose ends in tragedy. But surrender, real, raw, tear-stained surrender, leads to redemption. And that redemption can shake the very foundations of the enemy's kingdom. Samson lived alone for much of his life, isolated by his calling, misunderstood by his people, hunted by his enemies. But in the end, he was not alone. The God who called him as a boy stood with him as a broken man. And in that final embrace, in that last breath, we see the Father's heart. Not cold justice, not final judgment, but open arms. Samson came home not in triumph, but in truth, and the heavens received him. Not for what he had built, but for whom he had finally become. His story is not about a man with muscles. It's about a God with mercy. It's about a promise that does not expire. It's about how our worst moments can become the stage for God's greatest glory. Samson's enemies thought they won. But in his collapse, God's justice and mercy collided. And out of the rubble rose hope. For Israel. For us. For every soul caught between strength and fragility, purpose and passion, calling and compromise. Samson's story tells us, it's not too late. The pillars of your past may fall, but your future, surrendered, can still stand. So let the memory of Samson live on, not just as a tale of warning, but as a banner of grace. Let every weakness drive us to dependence. Let every fall teach us humility. Let every chain remind us that God still breaks them. And when we reach our end, may our final cry not be for revenge or recognition, but for remembrance. Like Samson, may we say, Lord, remember me. And may we find, even in the rubble that he already has,